On top of everything else, the bathroom was on the darkish side, and even if he had put on the light, the immortelle-like yellowness of daytime electricity would have been no help at all. Finishing his shave anyhow, he squeamishly climbed into the bath and groaned under the icy impact of the shower. Then he made a mistake with the towels and thought miserably that he would be smelling all day of Mariana Nikolaevna. The skin of his face smarted, revoltingly sheepish, and one particularly hot little ember on the side of his chin. Suddenly the door handle of the bathroom was jerked vigorously so that Shigolev was returning. Fyodor Konstantinovich waited for the footfalls to recede and then popped back to his room. Soon afterwards he entered the dining room. Mariana Nikolaevna was ladling out the soup. He kissed her rough head. Her daughter, who was just back from work, came to the table with slow steps, worn out and seemingly dazed by her office. She sat down with graceful languor, a cigarette on her long fingers, powder on her lashes, a turquoise silk jumper, short-cut, fair hair brushed back from the temple, sullenness, silence, ash. Shigolev gulped down a dram of vodka, tucked his napkin into his collar, and began to slop up his soup, looking over his spoon affably but cautiously at his stepdaughter. She was slowly mixing a white exclamation mark of sour cream into her borscht, but then, struggling her shoulders, she pushed her plate away. Mariana Nikolaevna, who had been gloomily watching her, threw her napkin on the table and left the dining room. "Come on, eat, Ada," said Shigolev, thrusting out his wet lips. Without a word of reply, as if he was not there, only the nostrils of her narrow nose quivered. She turned into her chair easily and naturally twisted her long body, obtained an ashtray from the sideboard behind her, placed it by her plate, and flicked some ash into it. Mariana Nikolaevna, with a hurt look beglooming her ample, crudely made-up face, returned from the kitchen. The daughter placed her left elbow on the table and, slightly leaning on it, slowly began her soup. "Well, Fyodor Konstantinovich," began Shigolev, having satisfied his first hunger, "it seems matters are coming to a head. A complete break with England, and Hancock walloped. You know it's already beginning to smell of something serious. You remember only the other day I said Koverda's shot was the first signal. War. You have to be very, very naive to deny it's inevitable. Judge for yourself in the Far East Japan cannot put up with," and Shigolev launched on a discussion of politics like many unpaid windbags. He thought he could combine the reports he read in newspapers by paid windbags into an orderly scheme, upon following which a logical and sober mind, in this case his mind, could with no effort explain and foresee a multitude of world events. The names of countries and their leading representatives became his hands something of the nature of labels for more or less full but essentially identical vessels, whose contents he poured this way and that. France was afraid of something or other, and therefore would never allow it. England was aiming at something. The statesman craved a rapprochement, while that one wanted to increase his prestige. Someone was plotting, and someone was striving for something. In short, the world Shigolev created came out as some kind of collection of limited, humorless, faceless, and abstract bullies, and the more brains, cunning, and circumspection he found in their natural activities, the more stupid, vulgar, and simple his world became. It used to be quite awesome that when he came across another similar lover of political prognosis, for example, there was the Colonel Kasatkin, who used to come sometimes to dinner, and then Shigolev's England clashed not with another Shigolev country, but with Kasatkin's England, equally non-existent, so that in a certain sense international wars turned into civil wars, although the warring sides existed on different levels which never came into contact with one another. At present, while listening to his landlord, Fyodor was amazed by the family likeness between the countries mentioned by Shigolev and the various parts of Shigolev's own body. Thus France corresponded to his warningly raised eyebrows, some kind of limit-trophies to the hairs on his nostrils. Some Polish corridor or other went along with his esophagus. Danzig was the click of his teeth, and Russia was Shigolev's bottom. He talked with all through the next courses, goulash, kissel, and after that, picking his teeth with broken match, went to take a nap. Mariana Nikolaevna busied herself with the dishes before doing the same. Her daughter, having not uttered a single word, went back to her office. Fyodor had only just managed to clear the bedclothes from the couch before the pupil arrived, the son of an emigre dentist, a fat, pale youth in horn-rimmed spectacles with a fountain pen in his breast pocket. Attending as he did a Berlin high school, the poor boy was so steeped in the local habitus that even in English he made the same ineradicable mistakes as any skittish-headed German would have made. There was no force on earth, for example, which could have stopped him from using the past continuous instead of the simple past, and this endowed every of his accidental activities of the day before the kind of idiotic permanence. Equally stubbornly, he handled the English also like the German also, and in overcoming the thorny end of the word clothes, he invariably added a superfluous sibilant syllable, clotheses, as if skidding after having cleared an obstacle. At the same time, he expressed himself freely in English, and had only sought the aid of a coach because he wanted to get the highest mark in the final examination. He was self-satisfied, discursive, obtuse, and Germanically ignorant, i.e., treated everything he did not know with skepticism, firmly believing that the humorous side of things had long since been worked out on the proper place for it, the back page of a Berlin Illustrated Weekly. He never laughed or limited himself to a condescending snicker. The only thing that could just barely amuse him was the story about some ingenious financial operation. His whole philosophy of life had been reduced to the simplest proposition: the poor man is unhappy, the rich man is happy. The legalized happiness was playfully put together to the accompaniment of first-class dance music out of various items of technical luxury, but the lesson he always did his best to come a little before the hour and tried to leave a little after it. Hurrying to his next trial, Fedor left together with him, and the latter, accompanying him as far as the corner, endeavored to collect a few more English expressions gratis. But Fedor, with dry glee, lapsed into Russian. They parted at the crossroads. It was a windy and shabby crossroads, not quite grown to the rank of square, although there was a church and a public garden and a corner pharmacy and a public convenience with thujas around it, and even triangular island with a kiosk, at which tram conductors regaled themselves with milk. A multitude of streets diverging in all directions, jumping out from behind corners, and skirting the above-mentioned places of prayer and refreshment, turned it all into one of those schematic little pictures on which are depicted for edification of beginning motorists all the elements of the city, all the possibilities for them to collide. To the right one saw the gates of a tram depot with 3 beautiful birches standing out against a cement background, and if, say, some absent-minded tram driver forgot to pause by the kiosk 3 yards before the lawful tram stop, a woman with parcels invariably making fussily to get off and being held back by everybody in order to throw the switch with the point of his iron rod. Alas, such absent-mindedness almost never occurred. The tram would have solemnly turned in under the glass dome, where it spent the night and was serviced. The church, which loomed to the left, encircled with a low belt of ivy, and the parterre surrounding it grew several dark bushes of rhododendron with purple flowers, and at night one used to see a mysterious man here with a mysterious lantern, looking for earthworms on the turf. For his birds were fishing opposite the church across the street beneath the radiance of a lawn sprinkler that waltzed on one spot with the ghost of a rainbow in its dewy arms. Was the green oblong lawn of the public garden, with young trees along either side, a silver fir among them, and a pie-shaped walk, in whose shadiest corner there was a sand-pit for children. But we touch this kind of rich sand only when we are burying someone we know. Behind the garden there was an abandoned soccer field, along which Fedor walked toward the Furstendamm. The green of the lindens, the black of the asphalt, the truck tires leaning against the railings by the shop for motor car accessories, the beaming young bride on a poster displaying a packet of margarine, the blue of the tavern sign, the gray of the house froths getting older as they got closer to the avenue, all this flickered by him for the 100th time. As always, with a few steps from the Furstendamm, he saw his bus sweep across the vista in front of him. The stop was immediately around the corner, but Fedor did not get there in time and was forced to wait for the next one. Over the entrance to a cinema, a black giant cutout of a cupboard had been erected, with turned-out feet, the blotch of a mustache on his white face beneath a bowler hat, and a bent cane in his hand. In wicker armchairs on the terrace of a neighboring cafe, businessmen sprawled in identical poses with their hands identically gabled in front of them, all very similar to one another as regards snouts and ties, but probably varied in the extent of their slovency. And by the curb stood a small car with a heavily damaged wing, broken windows, and bloody handkerchief on the running board. A half a dozen people still loafed around, gaping at it. Everything was sun-bottled. A puny old man with a dyed little beard, and wearing close spats, and sunning himself on a green bench with his back to the traffic, while opposite him, across the sidewalk, an elderly rosy-faced beggar woman with legs cut off at the pelvis was set like a bust at the foot of a wall and was selling paradoxical shoelaces. Between the houses could be seen a vacant lot, and on it something was modestly and mysteriously blooming. Beyond it, the continuous safety black backs of houses that seemed to have turned to leave carried strange, attractive, and seemingly completely autonomous whitish designs, reminding one not quite of the canals on Mars, and not quite of something very distant and half forgotten, like an accidental expression from a once heard fairy tale or an old scenery from some unknown play. Down the helical stairs of the bus that drew up came a pair of charming silk legs. We know, of course, that this had been worn threadbare by the efforts of 1,000 male riders, but nevertheless, down they came, these legs, and deceived. The face was revolting. The door climbed aboard, and the conductor, on the open top deck, smote its plated side with his palm to tell the driver he could move on. Along this side, along the toothpaste advertisement, upon which it swished the tips of soft maple twigs, it would have been pleasant to look down from above the gliding street ennobled by perspective, if it were not for the everlasting chilly thought, there he is, a special rare and as yet undescribed and unnamed variant of man. He is occupied with God knows what, running from lesson to lesson, wasting his youth on a boring and empty task, on the mediocre teaching of foreign languages, when he has his own language, out of which he can make anything he likes, a midge, a mammoth, 1,000 different clouds. What he should really be teaching was that mysterious and refined thing which he alone, out of 10,000, 100,000, perhaps even 1,000,000 men, knew how to teach. For example, multi-level thinking. You look at a person and you see him as clearly as if he were fashioned of glass and you were the glass blower, while at the same time, without in the least impinging upon that clarity, you notice some trifle on the side, such as the similarity of the telephone receiver's shadow to a huge, slightly crushed ant, and all this simultaneously, the convergence is joined by a third thought, the memory of a sunny evening at a Russian small railway station, i.e. images having no rational connection with the conversation you are carrying on, while your mind runs around the outside of your own words and along the inside of those of your interlocutor. Or a piercing pity for the tin box at a waste patch, for the cigarette card from the Series National costumes trampled in the mud, for the poor stray word repeated by the kind-hearted, weak, loving creature who had just been scolded for nothing, for all the trash of life which, by means of a momentary alchemic distillation, the royal experiment is turned into something valuable and eternal, or else the constant feeling that our days are only pocket money, farthings clinking in the dark, and that somewhere is stocked the real wealth, from which life should know how to get the dividends in the shape of dreams, tears of happiness, distant mountains, all this and much more, beginning with the very rare and painful so-called sense of the starry sky mentioned, it seems, only in one treatise, Parker's Travels of the Spirit, and ending with professional subtleties in the sphere of serious literature. He would have been able to teach, and teach well, to anyone who wanted it, but no one wanted it, and no one could. But it was a pity. He would have charged 100 marks an hour, the same as certain professors of music, and at the same time he found it amusing to remute himself. All this was nonsense, the shadows of nonsense, presumptuous dreams. I am simply a poor young Russian selling the surplus from a gentleman's upbringing, while scribbling verse in my spare time. That's the total of my little immortality. But even this shade of multifaceted thought, this play of the mind with its own self, had no prospective pupils. The bus whirled on, and presently he arrived at his destination, the place of a lone and lonesome young woman, very attractive in spite of her freckles, always wearing a black dress open at the neck, with lips like sealing wax on a letter, in which there was nothing. She continually looked at Fodor with pensive curiosity, and not only taking no interest in the remarkable novel by Stevenson, which he had been reading with her for the past 3 months, and before that they had read Kipling at the same rate, but also not understanding a single sentence, and noting down words as you would note down the address of someone you knew you would never visit. Even now, or more exactly, precisely now, and with greater agitation than before, Fodor, although in love with another who was incomparable in fascination and intelligence, wondered what would happen if he placed his palm on his trembling little hand with sharp fingernails, lying so invitingly close, and because he knew what would happen then, his heart suddenly began to thump and his lips immediately went dry. At this point, however, he was involuntarily sobered by a certain intonation of hers, her little laugh, the smell of that certain scent which somehow was always used by the very women who liked him, although to him this dullish Swedish brown smell was unbearable. She was a worthless, cunning woman with a sluggish soul, but even now, when the lesson was over and he had gone out into the street, he was seized by a vague feeling of annoyance. He could imagine much better, and he had just been able to, in her presence, how gaily and yieldingly her compact little body would probably have responded to everything, and with painful vividness he saw an imaginary mirror in his hand on her back, and her smooth auburn head thrown back, and then the mirror significantly emptied, and he experienced the most trivial of all feelings on earth, the stab of a missed opportunity. No, that was not so. He had missed nothing. The sole joy of these unrealizable embraces was their ease of avocation. During the past 10 years of lonely and restrained youth, living on a cliff where there was always a bit of snow, and from where it was a long way down to the little brewery town at the foot of the mountain, He had become accustomed to the thought that between the deceit of casual love and the sweetness of its temptation, there was a void, a gap in life, an absence of any real action on his part, so that on occasion, when he looked at a passing girl, he imagined simultaneously both the stupendous possibility of happiness and the repugnance for its inevitable imperfection, charging this one instant with romantic image, but diminishing its triptych by the middle section. He knew, therefore, for the reading of Stevenson would never be interrupted by a Dantean pause, knew that if such a break should take place, he would not experience a thing except a devastating chill, because the demands of the imagination were unfulfillable, and because the vacuousness of a gaze, forgiven for the sake of beautiful moist eyes, inevitably corresponded to a defect as yet concealed, the vacuous expression of breasts which it was impossible to forgive. But sometimes he envied the simple love life of other men, the same way they probably had a whistling while taking off their shoes. Crossing Wittenberg Square, whereas in a colored film, roses were quivering in the breeze around an antique flight of stairs which led down to an underground station, he walked toward the Russian bookshop. Between lessons there was a chink of spare time, as always happened when he came to this street, beginning under the auspices of a huge department store that sold all forms of local bad taste, and ending after several crossroads in the burgerish column, with popular shadows on the asphalt, all chalked over by hopscotchers. He met an elderly, morbidly embittered St. Petersburg writer who wore an overcoat in summer to hide the shabbiness of his suit, dreadfully skinny man with bulging dark brown eyes, wrinkles of fastidious distaste around his apish mouth, and one long, curved hair growing out of a big black pore on his broad nose, a detail which attracted Fyodor Konstantinovich's attention much more than the conversation of his clever schemer, who embarked immediately he met anyone upon something in the nature of a fable, a long far-fetched anecdote of yore, which turned out to be merely a prelude to some amusing gossip about a mutual acquaintance. Fyodor had barely got rid of him when he caught sight of two more riders, a good-naturedly gloomy Muscovite, whose carriage and aspect were somewhat reminiscent of the Napoleon of the island period, and a satirical poet from the Berlin Russian emigre paper, a frail little man with a kindly wit and a quiet, hoarse voice. These two, like their predecessor, invariably turned up in the region which they used for leisurely walks, rich in encounters, so that it seemed as if on this German street there had encroached the vagabond phantom of a Russian boulevard, or as if on the contrary street in Russia, with several natives taking the air, swarmed with the pale ghosts of innumerable foreigners, flickering among those natives like a familiar and barely noticeable hallucination. They chatted about the rider just encountered, and Fyodor sailed on. After a few steps he noticed Konchiev, reading on the stroll of Feuilleton, the bottom of the Paris Russian emigre paper, with a marvelous, angelic smile on his round face. The engineer Kern came out of a Russian food shop, cautiously thrusting a small parcel into the briefcase pressed up against his chest, and on across the street, like the confluence of people in a dream, in the last chapter of Turgenev's Smoke, he caught a glimpse of Mariana Nikolaevna Shkolev, with some other lady mustachioed and very stout, who perhaps was Madame Abramov. Immediately after that, Alexander Yakovlevich Shcherdinsky cut across the street to know a mistake, a stranger not even very like him. Fyodor Konstantinovich reached the bookshop. In the window what you could see among the zigzags, cogs, and numerals of Soviet-cover designs. This was the time when the fashion there was to have titles like Third Love, The Sixth Sense, and Point 17, several new emigre publications, a corpulent new romance by General Katcharin, The Red Princess, Konchiev's Communication, the pure white paperbacks of two venerable novelists, an anthology of recitable poetry published in Riga, the minute palm-sized volume of young poetess, a handbook, What a Driver Should Know, and the last work of Dr. Utin, The Foundations of a Happy Marriage. There were also several old St. Petersburg engravings, in one of which the mirror-like transposition had put the rostral column over the wrong side of the neighboring buildings. The owner of the shop was not there. He had gone to the dentist, and his place was taken by a rather accidental young lady reading a Russian translation of Kellerman's The Tunnel in a fairly uncomfortable pose on the counter. Fyodor Konstantinovich approached the table where the emigre periodicals were displayed. He unfolded the literary number of the Paris Russian News. With a chill of sudden excitement, he saw that the Feuilleton by Christopher Mortis was devoted to communication. What if he demolishes it? Fyodor managed to think with a mad hope already, however, hearing in his ears not the melody of detraction, but the sweeping roar of a deafening praise. He greedily began to read. I do not remember who said, perhaps Rozanov said it somewhere, began Mortis stealthily, and citing first this unauthentic quotation and then some thought expressed by somebody in a Paris cafe after someone's lecture, it began to narrow these artificial circles around Konchev's communication. But even so, to the very end, he never touched the center, but only directed now and then a mesmeric gesture toward it from the circumference, and again revolved. The result was something in the nature of those black spirals on cardboard circles which were everlastingly spinning in the windows of Berlin ice cream parlors in a crazy effort to turn into bullseyes. It was a venomously disdainful dressing down without a single remark to the point, without a single example, and not so much the critic's words as his whole manner made a pitiful and dubious phantom out of a book which Mortis could not fail to have read with delight, and from which he avoided quoting in order not to damage himself in the disparity between what he wrote and what he was writing about. The whole review seemed to be a seance for the summoning of a spirit which is announced in advance to be, if not a fraud, at least a delusion of the senses. These poems, ended Mortis, induce in the reader an indefinite but unsuperable repulsion. People friendly to Konchev's talent will probably think them enchanting. We shall not quarrel. Perhaps this is really so, but in our difficult times with their new responsibilities, when the very air is imbued with a subtle mortal angoisse, an awareness of which the infallible mark of genuineness in a contemporary poet, abstract and melodious little pieces about dreamy visions are incapable of seducing anyone, and in truth, it is with a kind of joyous relief that one passes from them to any kind of human document, to what one can read between the words, and certain Soviet writers, granted even without talent, to an artless and sorrowful confession, to a private letter dictated by emotion and despair. At first, Fyodor Konstantinovich felt an acute, almost physical pleasure from this article, but it immediately dispersed and was replaced by a queer sensation, as if he had been taking part in a sly, evil business. He recalled Konchev's smile of a moment ago, over these very lines, of course, and it occurred to him that a similar smile might apply to him, Godunov-Sherdintsev, whom envy had leagued with the critic. Here he recalled that Konchev himself in his critical reviews had more than once from the heights of in fact just as unscrupulously stung Mortis, who was, by the way, in private life a woman of middle age, the mother of a family who in her youth had published excellent poems in the St. Petersburg Review, Apollo, and who now lived modestly 2 steps from the grave of Marie Bashkirtsev, suffering from an incurable eye illness which endowed Mortis's every line with a kind of tragic value, and when Fyodor realized the infinitely flattering hostility of this article, he felt disappointed that no one wrote about him like that. He also looked through a little illustrated weekly published by Russian emigres in Warsaw and found a review on the same subject, but of a completely different cut. It was a critique both. The local Valentin Linyov, who from issue to issue used to pour out his formless, reckless, and not altogether grammatical literary impressions, was famous not only for not being able to make sense of the book he reviewed, but also for not having apparently read it to the end, jauntily using the author as a springboard, carried away by his own paraphrase, exacting isolated phrases in support of his incorrect conclusions, misunderstanding the initial pages, and thereafter energetically pursuing a false trail. He would make his way to the penultimate chapter in the blissful state of a passenger who still does not know, and in this case never finds out, that he was boarded the wrong train. It invariably happened that, having leafed blindly through the long novel with a short story, size played no part in it. He would provide the book with his own ending, usually exactly opposite to the author's intention. In other words, if, say, Gogol had been a contemporary and Linyov were writing about him, Linyov would remain firmly on the innocent conviction that Pleskakov was indeed the Inspector General, but when, as now, he wrote about poetry, his artlessly employed the device of so-called interquotational footbridges. His discussion of Konchev's book boiled down to his answering for the author a kind of implied album questionnaire. Your favorite flower, favorite hero? Which virtue do you prize most? The poet, Linyov wrote of Konchev. Likes. There followed a string of quotations forcibly distorted by their combination in the demands of the accusative case. He dreads more bleeding stumps of verse. He finds solace in Mimiju, but on the other hand, 3/4 of a line turned by means of quotes into a flat statement. At times it seems to him that, and here Linyov inadvertently extricated something more or less whole. Days of ripening vines, in the avenues, blue-shaded statues, the fair heavens that lean on the motherland's shoulders of snow, and it was as if the voice of a violin had suddenly drowned the hum of a patriarchal cretin. On another table a little farther, Soviet editions were laid out, and one could bend over the Morris of Moscow magazines, over a hell of boredom, or even try to make out the agonizing constriction of capitalized abbreviations carried like doomed cattle all over Russia and horribly recalling the lettering of freight cars, the banging of their buffers, the clanking, the hunchbacked greaser of the lantern, the piercing melancholy of god-forsaken stations, the shudder of Russian trails, infinitely long-distance trains between the star and the red lamp, trembling in railway smoke, lay an edition of the Soviet chess magazine 8 by 8. As Fedor leafed through it, rejoicing over the human language of the problem diagrams, he noticed a small article with a picture of a thin, bearded old man glowering over his spectacles. The article was headed, Shereshevsky in Chess. He thought that this might amuse Alexander Yakovlevich, and partly for this reason, and partly because in general he liked chess problems, he took the magazine, the girl tearing herself away from Kellerman. Couldn't say how much it cost, but knowing that Fedor was anyway in debt to the shop, she indifferently let him go. He went away with the pleasant feeling that he would have some fun at home, being not only an excellent solver of problems, but also being gifted to the highest degree with the ability to compose them. He found therein not only a rest from his literary labors, but certain mysterious lessons. As a writer, he derived something from the very sterility of these exercises. A chess composer does not necessarily have to play well. Fedor was a very indifferent player and played unwillingly. He was fatigued and infuriated by the disharmony between the lack of stamina and his chess thought in the process of contest, and that exclamation mark rating brilliance from which it strove. For him, the construction of a problem differed from the playing in about the same way as a verified sonnet does from the polemics and publicists. The making of such a problem began far from the board, as the making of a verse began far from the paper, with the body of a horizontal position on the sofa, i.e., when the body becomes a distant dark blue line, its own horizon, when suddenly from an inner impulse which was indistinguishable from poetic inspiration, he envisioned a bizarre method of embodying this or that refined idea for a problem, say the combination of two themes, the Gideon and the Bristol, or something completely new. For some time he delighted with closed eyes in the abstract purity of a plan realized only in his mind's eye. Then he hastily opened his morocco board and the box of weighty pieces, set them out roughly on the run, and it immediately became clear that the idea so purely embodied in his brain would demand here on the board, in order to free it of its thick carved shell, inconceivable labors, a maximum of mental strain, endless trials and worries, and most of all, that consistent resourcefulness out of which, in the chess sense, truth is constructed, pondering the alternatives, thus and thus excluding cumbrous constrictions, the blots and blanks of support pawns struggling with duels, he achieved the utmost accuracy of expression, the utmost economy and harmonious forces. If he had not been certain, if he is also the case of literary creation, that the realization of the scheme already existed in some other world, from which he transferred it into this one, then the complex and prolonged work on the board would have been an intolerable burden to the mind, since it would have had to concede, together with the possibility of realization, the possibility of its impossibility. Little by little the pieces and squares began to come to life and exchange impressions. The crude might of the queen was transformed into refined power. Restrained and directed by a system of sparkling levers, the pawns grew cleverer, the knight stepped forward with a Spanish caracal. Everything had acquired a sense, and at the same time everything was concealed. Every creator is a plotter, and all the pieces impersonating his ideas on the board were here as conspirators and sorcerers, only in the final instinct was their secret spectacularly exposed. One or two more refining touches, one more verification, and the problem was ready. The key to it, White's first move, was masked by its apparent absurdity, and it was precisely by the distance between this and the dazzling denouement that one of the problem's chief merits was measured, and in the way that one piece, as if greased with oil, went smoothly behind another after slipping across the whole field and creeping under its arm, constituted an almost physical pleasure, the titillating sensation of an ideal fit. Now on the board there shone like a constellation, a ravishing work of art, a planetarium of thought. Everything here cheered the chess player's eye. The wit of the threats of defenses, the grace of their interlocked movement, the purity of the mates, so many bullets for exactly so many hearts. Every polished piece seemed to be made especially for its square, but perhaps the most fascinating of all, the fine fabric of deceit, the abundance of insidious tires, the refutation of which had its own accessory beauty, and of false trails carefully prepared for the reader. The third lesson that Friday was with Vasilev, the editor of the Berlin Emigre Daily, had established relations with an obscure English periodical and now contributed a weekly article to it on the situation of Soviet Russia. Having a smattering of the language, he wrote in his article out in rough, with gaps and Russian phrases interspersed, and demanding from Fedor a literal translation of the usual faces-founded leaders. "You're only young once. Wonders never cease. This is a lion and not a dog. Krylov, troubles never come singly. Peter's been paid without robbing Paul, jack of all trades, master of none. You can't make a silk purse out of a sow's ear. Necessity is the mother of invention. It is only a lover's tip. Hark at the pot calling the kettle black. Birds of a feather flock together. The poor man always gets the blame. It's no use crying over spilt milk. We need reform, not reforms. And very often there occurred the expression. It produced the impression of an exploding bomb. Fedor's task consisted in dictating from Vasilev's rough copy of Vasilev's article, and is corrected from direct into the typewriter. This seemed extraordinarily practical to Vasilev, but actually the dictation was monstrously dragged out as a result of the agonizing pauses. But oddly enough, the method of using old saws and fables turned out to be a convinced way of conveying something of the moralities characteristic of all conscious manifestations of the Soviet authorities. Reading through the finished article, which had seemed rubbish as he dictated it, Fedor detected under the clumsy translation of the author's journalistic effects the movement of a logical and forceful idea, which progressed steadily toward its goal and calmly produced a mate in its corner. Accompanying him afterwards to the door, Vasilev, with a sudden fierce knitting of his bristly brows, said quickly, "Well, did you see what they have done to Konchiev? I can imagine how it affected him. What a blow, what a flop." "He couldn't care less, I know that," replied Fedor, and an expression of momentary disappointment appeared on Vasilev's face. "Oh, he's just putting it on," he retorted resourcefully, cheering up again. "In reality, he's sure to be stunned." "I don't think so," said Fedor. "In any case, I'm sincerely grieved for him," ended Vasily, with the look of one who had no wish at all to part with his grief. Somewhat weary but glad of the fact that his working day was over, Fedor Konstantinovich boarded a tram and opened his magazine. Again that glimpse of Chernyshevsky's inclined face. "All I know about him is that he was a syringe of sulfuric acid, as Rozanov, I think, says somewhere, and that he wrote the novel What to Do, which blends in my mind with another social writer's, Whose Fault?" He became absorbed in an examination of the problems and soon satisfied himself that it had not been for the 2 endgames of genius by Old Russian Master plus several interesting reprints from the foreign publications, this 8x8 would not have been worth buying. The conscientious student exercises of the young Soviet composers was not so much problems as tasks. Cumbrously they treated this or that mechanical themes, some kind of spinning and unpinning without hint of poetry. These were the chess comic strips, nothing more. The shoving and jostling pieces did their clumsy work with proletarian seriousness, reconciling themselves to the presence of double solutions in the flat variants and the agglomeration of police pawns. Having missed his stop, he still managed to jump off at the public garden, turning once on his heels, as a man usually does after abruptly leaving a tram, and went by the church along Agamenovstrasse. It was early evening, and the sky was cloudless, and the motionless and quiet sunshine endowed every object with a peaceful lyrical air of festivity. A bicycle leaned against a yellow-lit wall, was slightly bent outwards like one of the side houses of a troika, but even more perfect in shape was its transparent shadow on the wall. An elderly, stoutish gentleman, rigging his ear, was hurrying to tennis, wearing a fancy shirt and city trousers, and carrying these gray balls in a net, and beside him, walking swiftly on rubber soles, was a German girl of the sporting sort, with an orange face and golden hair. Behind the brightly painted pumps of a radio was singing at a gas station, while above its pavilion, in vertical yellow letters, stood against the light blue of the sky the name of a car firm, and on the second letter the E, a pity that it was not on the first, on the B, would have made an alphabetic vignette, sat a live blackbird with a yellow for economist's sake. Bleak, singing louder than the radio. The house in which Fedor lived was in a corner one, stuck out like a huge red ship carrying on complex and glassy turreted structure on its bow, as if dull, sedate architect had suddenly gone mad and made a sally into the sky. On all the little balconies which girdled the house in tier after tier there was something green blossoming, and only the Shigolev's was untidily empty, with an orphaned pot on the parapet and a corpse hung out in moth-eaten furs to air. Right at the very beginning of his stay in this rat, Fedor, supposing that he would need complete peace in the evenings, had reserved himself the right to have supper in his room. On the table among his books there now awaited him 2 gray sandwiches with a glossy mosaic of sausage, a cup of stale tea, and the plate of pink Kaisel from the morning. Chewing and sipping, he once again opened 8x8 and was again glared at by the budding Ng Ch, and began to enjoy quietly a study in which a few white pieces seemed to be hanging over an abyss and yet won the day. Then he found a charming four mover by an American master, the beauty of which consisted not only of the cleverly hidden baiting device, but also the fact that in reply to a tempting but incorrect attack, Black, by drawing in and blocking his own pieces, managed to construct just in time a hermetic stalemate. Then on one of the Soviet productions, P. Mitrofanov Tver, A beautiful example turned up of how to come a cropper. Black had 9 pawns, the 9th having evidently been at the last minute in order to cure a crook. As if a writer had hastily changed, he will surely be told, and the proofs to the more correct, he will doubtless be told, without noticing that this is immediately followed by of her doubtful reputation. Suddenly he felt a bitter pang. Why had everything in Russia become so shoddy, so crabbed and grey? How could she have been so befooled and befuddled? Or had the old urge toward the light concealed a fatal flaw, which in the course of progress toward the objective had grown more and more evident until it was revealed that this light was burning in the window of a prison overseer, and that was all? When had this strange dependence sprung up, between the sharpening thirst and the muddying of the source? In the 40s? In the 60s? And what to do now? Ought one not to reject any longing for one's homeland, for any homeland besides that which is within me, which is stuck like the silver sand of the sea to the skin of my soul, lives in my eyes, my blood, gives depth and distance to the background of life's every hope? Some day, interrupting my writing, I will look through the window and see Russian autumn. Some friends of the Shigolevs, gone to Denmark for the summer, had recently left Boris Ivanovich a radio. One could hear him diddling with it, strangling speakers and creakers, moving ghostly furniture, an odd pastime. The room meanwhile had grown dark. Above the blackened outlines of the houses beyond the yard, where the windows were already alight, the sky had an ultramarine shade, and in the black wires between black chimneys there shone a star which, like any star, could only properly be seen by switching one's vision so that all the rest moved away and out of focus. He propped his cheek on his fist and there sat at the table, looking through the window. In the distance, a large clock whose position he always promised himself to define, but always forgot, the more so since it was never audible under the layer of daytime sound, slowly chimed 9 o'clock. It was time to go and meet Sina.